Destiny 2 PvP. Love it or hate it, it has always been one of the most influential parts of Destiny 2. Teaming up to get a flawless card, grinding for 7th columns, or just hanging out while you wait for your teammates to finally get on. The Crucible has long been a place for sweatlords and casuals to pit their skills against each other. This is the topic of today's video, to relive what was the top guns and most popular loadouts. So sit back, relax, and let's take a journey into the history of Destiny 2 PvP metas. Quick note before we get started. This video will primarily focus on primary and secondary metas. I'm going to try not to mention abilities or heavy weapons, so if I don't mention Wardcliff or Hammerhead, now you know. Anyway, let's get started. Destiny 2 Year 1 was something special. Leaving the Destiny 1 formula, snipers and shotguns, beloved secondary weapons, now had been moved to the heavy weapon slot. So for the first year of game time, a kinetic primary weapon and an energy primary weapon was what the community was stuck with. Not only was the new loadout style making the community's life difficult, but the second biggest change was the time to kill, or TTK, had been increased considerably. Scout rifles were a 5-shot headshot, and it took 3 punches to kill an enemy. This change was an attempt to make the game more accessible to new players, but all it did was make the first meta in Destiny 2 into a camping meta. Winning one-on-one fights was rarely an option. Instead, you would sit with your teammates and fight the enemy at a distance. The first to overexpose themselves was the loser. Surprisingly, almost every primary, except for hand cannons, was usable. Pulse rifles had Hero's Burden and Vigilance Wing, auto rifles had Uriel's Gift and Prosecutor, and scout rifles had the End and the Mananan. Most noteworthy of all was the Mida multi-tool. With its superb handling, clean scope, and ease of accessibility, the Mida was the first true meta primary. With your primary being the sit in the back and wait gun, what happened if the enemy pushed you? This is where sidearms and newly introduced SMGs came into play. However, SMGs were frankly underpowered. While some people defended them and could use them to effect, sidearms were the true secondary meta, most prominently the Last Hope. This 3-burst sidearm was demolishing every other gun at close range. Seriously, some kind of worked, but nothing compared to Last Hope. As for heavies, your options were limited. Hawthorne's Field Forged and the Sudden Death were the preferred shotguns. Yes, shotguns were in the heavy slot. Alone as a God and the Long Walk were the meta snipers, although to be fair, snipers were hardly meta, and nothing could compete with the main ingredient when it came to fusion rifles. So yeah, these were the meta guns for nearly the entirety of Destiny 2's first year. The first big change would come in late March of 2018. Bungie finally admitted that this slow playstyle wasn't quite the vision they had originally intended. With the appropriately named Go Fast update, things got faster. Not as fast as they needed to, but it was a start. And granted, the Go Fast update was more focused on PvE, but PvP still benefited, and this was only a taste of what was to come. May 8th, 2018 saw the introduction of Warmind, arguably the most well-received expansion in Year 1. As with nearly every expansion, nerfs and buffs would come, but to be honest, the PvP meta didn't change. Autos and scout rifles, Mida, kept the camping meta very much alive. However, with Warmind, one gun would get a major buff that would give the community a glimpse of what was to come. The exotic pulse rifle Graviton Lance got a rework. Now normally you would think an overpowered gun like this would get patched relatively quickly, but in this case, Bungie went out of their way to not nerf it, saying that this is what the new meta was going to feel like with the upcoming Forsaken expansion, and it was good for the community to get a feel for it. Needless to say, the community was very, very excited for what was to come. Side note, no, Redrix and Claymore was not good. It was never good. Desperado was good, but the Redrix twins, they always sucked. Arguably the best expansion Bungie has ever made. Literally everything was an improvement. And not just for the story, or for PvE, but for PvP as well. Hand cannons were now a 3 headshot for a kill. Shotguns in the special slot brought about a new era of this. And if less of a spray and play and more of a precision shotgun was needed, Bungie reintroduced the Chaperone to Destiny 2. Especially for controller players, this gun would revolutionize the shotgun meta, even to this day. Now, most guns would get buffed in Forsaken. With Bungie essentially reworking the entire game, the camping meta almost overnight was discarded in favor of a new rushing / outgunning your opponent meta. With this, scout rifles were nearly discarded completely. Pulse rifles took over the mid-range, and hand cannons saw their first rise to power. Speaking of hand cannons, before we move along, let me remind you of the 2 most powerful hand cannons Bungie would ever produce: Luna's Howl and Not Forgotten. Earned through the competitive playlist, Luna's in NF would break an already broken game. Just for context, let's discuss hand cannons for a second. Hand cannons were divided into 4 groups: 110 RPM, 140 RPM, 150, and 180 RPM. 110s were a heavy-hitting 3-tap to the head. 140 and 150s were a medium-weight 3-tap to the head, and 180s were a lightweight, fast-firing 4-tap to the head. 110s were relatively niche. They were good, just rarely optimal. With 150s and 140s being almost identical in design, 150s almost always outclass 140s due to their faster firing rate. Unless specifically called out, we can just forget 140s exist, okay? Cool. 180s, on the other hand, were very, very memorable. Truss with explosive payload was one of the most powerful guns in the game. However, the aforementioned Luna's Howl and Not Forgotten were on a different level of broken. They were both 180s, but if you got 2 quick headshots, you would activate its magnificent Howl perk, which gave you bonus damage for a short while, allowing you to 3-tap Guardians. Like I said, these Crucible exclusives were busted. As for special weapons, shotguns were the dominant secondary. Dustrock Blues, Mindbender's Ambition, and the Chaperone, as mentioned, were definitely the most used. Fusion rifles got a massive buff, and were able to kill at frankly unfair ranges. Yeah, facing the Erentil, it sucked. Snipers, on the other hand, were honestly a bit underpowered. They weren't bad, they just went largely unused. Don't worry though, their time will come. As for SMGs and sidearms, they would never be quote-unquote a bad choice, but especially with the community finally not being locked with double primaries, they wouldn't be on the forefront of the meta for a while. And with this, the Forsaken meta was set. Hand cannons or pulse rifles with either a shotgun or a fusion rifle. And this would be the meta year 2 would start out with. With Black Armory, not much would change. The meta stayed nearly identical to what it started with in Forsaken. The only 3 noteworthy entries were the Forge Pulse Rifle Blast Furnace. This thing was the new best pulse rifle in the game. With its low zoom and hard-hitting 4-round burst, it reigned supreme. And the new Crucible quest weapon, Mountaintop, would ironically become the new best PvE weapon, but honestly, it was a menace in the Crucible. Mountaintop's introduction would bring a new entry into the ranking system of Crucible metas. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't exactly meta, so I'm going to put it in its own middle spot that I'm going to call cheese guns. While not good enough to take the top spot, if you were ever struggling, use a cheese gun and you'll probably win. Think noob tubes from Call of Duty. Cool? Cool. Except for Jotun. If you ever use this, you're not cool. Just saying. Although, you are cool if you slap that subscribe button. And lastly, the only gun to change the meta so much that it's used even to this day. The Hipfire King, the last word. Yes, this monstrosity from D1 was reintroduced and is one of those rare guns that, even though hit with multiple nerfs, it would still be a viable and frankly dominant option. Joker's Wild was the next expansion, and while not a lot of changes happened, the changes that did happen were significant. The Luna twins, Luna's Howl and Not Forgotten, were finally nerfed, going from 180 to 150 RPM, and taking a noteworthy damage hit. They would finally fall out of the spotlight. While not inherently bad, in fact, they were still good. They would be replaced by the new best primary, the Spare Rations Hand Cannon. Now in these videos, I do try to keep my opinion out of this, but this meta right here would be the best meta Destiny 2 would ever have. The Spare Rations hand cannon and the previously mentioned Mindbender's shotgun. Aside from these, the meta would only get one outlier, the Crucible SMG Recluse. While it would be more notable as a PvE beast, gamers of this era will remember it was a nasty choice in the Crucible. Oh yeah, there was also this little thing called Thorn. It probably wouldn't go to be one of the best hand cannons ever made. Probably nothing. The Season of Opulence would bring one of the rarest things in Destiny, an archetype change in the meta. One thing about Destiny metas you have to remember, in PvE, it isn't uncommon for metas to change almost every season. However, in PvP, once an archetype becomes meta, it is very difficult for that weapon archetype to fall out or for a new one to rise up. That's just how Destiny works. So just imagine the community's surprise when a sniper rifle took the game by storm, the Revoker. If you know, you know. And if you don't, the Revoker had a perk where if you missed your shot, it would auto-regenerate ammo for you. Aside from this massive archetype addition, Bungie would introduce 3.5 guns that would be community favorites for years. The beloved sniper rifle, the definitely not Iasluna Austringer hand cannon, and the Rose hand cannon. Oh, and that half a gun? Arbalest. I say half a gun because it was loved in the PvE community, but it was slated to be one of the cheesiest PvP weapons ever. Seriously, on console, this thing was easy headshots. And I'm not even gonna give a point to Lord of Wolves. This was the stuff of nightmares. To be fair, these last two seasons were one of the best spots the Crucible was ever in. Gamers would always look back on Opulence, and year 2 as a whole, as one of the community's favorite times. The new seasonal expansion, Shadowkeep, was one of the most game-jarring expansions Bungie would make for PvE, completely turning the meta on its head. And if you want to see why, check out this video I made. It'll show everything. While this was an arguably bad expansion for PvE, it wasn't half bad for PvP. Shotguns and hand cannons were still king. Pulse rifles were very good at the mid-range. Snipers had about a season to take the community's attention, and it was starting to work. And fusions were still very strong, much to the community's anguish. Aside from the Randy's throwing knife scout rifle, no new weapons would make any noteworthy appearance. As a side note, Crimson, the Red Death wannabe, got a buff this season, and would haunt the dreams of console gamers for years to come. In my opinion, the best exotic hand cannon in the game. Suck at Ace of Spades users. Season of Dawn was the last sane season we would ever see. The meta would stay relatively the same. Spare Bender, Revoker Not Forgotten, and the occasional pulse rifle. But a, let's call sub-meta, would start to evolve. Here's what I mean. Remember the cheese guns I was talking about? Mountaintop, Jotun, Lord of Wolves, Arbalest? Well, this season would bring about 2 new cheese guns, Devil's Ruin and Bastion. What little skill ceiling was in this game was now obliterated by the now obscene amount of guns that required absolutely no skill to be effective with. Now some of you may ask, Vertical, why does it matter? It's Destiny PvP. No one takes it seriously anymore. Ever since they removed trials over a year and a half ago, there hasn't been anything meaningful to do. Right?
Welcome to the trials of Saint 14. Ha! A joke.
Season of the Worthy has long been accepted as the worst season in Destiny 2. Between the bugs, lackluster content, horrible public event, and frankly mediocre loot, no one was happy. Except for PvP mains. I didn't specify this earlier, but the premier PvP activity, Trials of the Nine, was deleted when Forsaken was released. And for over a year, PvP mains were left with almost nothing to grind for. But after an ungodly wait, Bungie finally decided to reintroduce the beloved Trials of Osiris from Destiny 1. While this would be a positive thing for the community overall, all of the aforementioned cheese guns went from being annoying to rage-inducing. On the whole, most cheese guns would never get nerfed, aside from fusion rifles. This would be their last good season, thank the Traveler. One meta change that was worthy of being mentioned was auto rifles. They had always been okay, But Suros regime, and weirdly the Hardlight, took the top spot for a short while. Suros had always been decent, but Hardlight got a buff to its ricochet damage. This would bring a bit of the OG camping meta back. However, it was not strong enough to combat the well-established shoddy sniper and hand cannon auto meta. One addition of note was the reintroduction of Fellwinter's Lie, a favorite from Destiny 1, an aggressive frame shotgun, perfectly rolled, and intrinsically had shot package, essentially a tighter spread for more damage at range. All of this built a very fast shotgun that could one-tap supers. While Season of the Worthy would long be regarded as one of the worst seasons in Destiny 2, it arguably might be remembered as one of the most influential PvP seasons we would ever get. Season of Arrivals had next to nothing to add. Seriously, this isn't me trying to cut the video length or anything. With Bungie focusing on its next big yearly update, so big it was delayed 2 months, very little changed about the PvP meta. Witherhorde was the new cheese gun on the block, being able to camp lanes like only grenades could previously, and Gnawing Hunger was the new best auto rifle to use in trials. I promise that's all that happened. But trust me, Beyond Light, the next yearly update, was about to change everything. Beyond Light was one of the most controversial expansions in Destiny. In my opinion, it was the most controversial. 2 massive changes would wake the community, for better or for worse. 1, Stasis. The first new subclass Bungie would introduce, and it would break the game.
Where is he? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6,
Is it more embarrassing to sit around and watch?
7, 8.
Pre-nerf Stasis was ludicrously broken. Stasis alone would almost ruin the game for the next 3 months until a proper balance would arrive. Yes, many shadow dives happened, and good riddance. Number 2, sunsetting. Hey, the bane of so many Guardians. While many guns were lost in this transition, archetype-wise, the meta did stay relatively consistent. Auto rifles were still solid, hand cannons were still at the top, pulse rifles dominated the mid-game, and specials? Shotguns and snipers were still good. In the next season, Season of the Chosen, the community would still be trying to tame the beast that was Stasis, but Bungie would throw another curveball at us. So in the last season, 110 RPM hand cannons were changed to 120 RPM, just to give them a little bit more of an advantage. But the community largely ignored them. But with the new Trials hand cannon, Igneous Hammer, the community discovered that 120s were, frankly, overpowered. But, by far, the most broken cheese gun in Destiny history had been unleashed. Very rarely does a primary take the spot of top cheese gun, but this abomination would go to put a mark on the Crucible that wouldn't go away for a while, if ever. Seriously, it was that bad. Okay, let's move on before I remember this thing too much. One of the most unassuming seasons was next, Season of the Splicer. Almost nothing was added this season, but 2 noteworthy nerfs happened. 120 RPM hand cannons were toned down a hair. Now, instead of broken, they were just good. And Stasis finally started to receive its first few nerfs. It wouldn't be in a perfect spot, but this season started the chain reaction that would be balancing the most broken subclass in D2. And that's all for the season. Moving on. Season of the Lost and the consecutive 30th anniversary saw a couple additions to the meta. And I don't completely mean that in a good way. First off, Lawrence Driver.
Own sea lost. All of you together. 2 down. 3 opponents.
Lawrence saw the Cheese Lord Arbalist and thought, hey, how about we add a black hole to that? Okay, real talk for a sec. Is this fair and balanced? The next cheese gun was the Forerunner sidearm. Now, this one is a bit borderlining for me. It's broken if you're at range, but up close, it's fairly useless. Odd for a sidearm. What do you think? Comment below if you think it's fair for me to include the Forerunner on the cheese gun list. On the positive side though, some familiar faces would reappear. The D1 classics IS Luna, the real one this time, Matador 64, and the 1,000-yard stare sniper rifle would warm the hearts of D1 veterans, being staples of the Crucible even to this day. And that's about it. Now, some of you might be confused by my odd choice for a stopping point, but to be honest, I do feel like it's very appropriate. The Destiny 2 PvP meta, truthfully, was set all the way back in year 2. 140 hand cannons, pulse rifles, and some auto rifles rarely leave the primary slot. Shotguns were always strong, and snipers were top tier post Opulence. And while these make the backbone of the meta, the Crucible is more filled with overpowered, low risk, and high reward weapons. And yes, I consider that a bad thing. Imagine a Call of Duty game where half the lobby has noob tubes. That's the Destiny Crucible meta right now. And not to end this video on a downer note, the meta is honestly in a half decent spot. Bungie just needs to take as many of what I've been calling cheese guns out, and we'd have a pretty solid game. What do you guys think? Is the Destiny 2 PvP experience good, worth saving, or completely lost? In any sense, I hope you've enjoyed this little history lesson and hope you have a great day. See you next time, Guardians.